Conflict can be both constructive and destructive. One major conflict resolution expert argues that whether conflict is positive or negative is determined by the parties' responses to the conflict rather than by the conflict itself. Let's take a look at conflict in organizations. Conflict is a disagreement that arises when two or more parties perceive a threat to their interests, needs, or concerns. Behaviors that escalate a conflict until the conflict seems to take on a life of its own generate dysfunctional conflict. Dysfunctional conflict focuses on emotions and differences between the two parties and can denigrate to the extent that the parties forget the substantive issues and focus on getting even, retaliating, and even hurting the other party. Not only can dysfunctional conflict negatively influence employees, work groups, and company performance, but it can also lead to employee depression, absenteeism, turnover, burnout, and negative emotional stress. At the same time, though, conflict can also be positive. For example, have you ever ended a disagreement feeling better about something? When it's effectively managed, conflict can be healthy. Interpersonal conflict can lead to greater learning, flexibility, and creativity. Behaviors that are adaptive and responsive to the situation, person, and issues create constructive conflict. Constructive conflicts, also called functional conflicts, balance the interests of both parties to maximize mutual gains and the attainment of mutual goals. Constructive conflicts contain elements of creativity, adaptation, and a desire to discover a mutually acceptable outcome. Constructive conflict can lead to the identification of new alternatives and ideas. Constructive conflict is a natural, inevitable, and creative force and can be beneficial to employees and their organization. Conflict is a disagreement that arises when two or more parties perceive a threat to their interests, needs, or concerns. Task conflict is a disagreement about tasks or goals. A moderate amount of task conflict is beneficial in the early stages of a project because it increases innovation and generates more alternatives from which to choose. However, task conflict is more likely to be detrimental over time when tasks are complex. Task conflict can be very productive if handled correctly. Have you ever wanted to do a task one way but someone else preferred a different strategy? Even when we agree about what we're trying to accomplish, we can still disagree about how we should accomplish it. Process conflict reflects conflict about how to accomplish a task, who is responsible for what, and how things should be delegated. Role ambiguity increases process conflict. If a manager does not clearly assign work tasks to employees, employees may experience process conflict as they jockey with each other to do the most desirable assignments and avoid the least desirable tasks. Have you ever had trouble working with someone because you just didn't like the person? Conflicts can arise from interpersonal differences in motivations, assumptions, or personality. Interpersonal differences are a common trigger of relationship conflict, which is the result of incompatibility or differences between individuals and groups. Relationship conflict can be triggered by personality, particularly the personality traits of dogmatism or power motivation. Relationship problems can often fuel disputes and lead to an uncertainty in escalating spirals of dysfunctional conflict. The availability and allocation of scarce resources is a major source of conflict in organizations. Incompatible needs and competition over perceived or actual resource constraints can create conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest can occur when someone believes that they have to satisfy their own needs. The needs and interests of someone else must be sacrificed. Change also causes conflict. Indeed, it's been said that change is not possible without conflict. One of the primary drivers of conflict is uncertainty. Organizational changes, including reorganization, downsizing, and changing business strategies, increase uncertainty and opportunities for resource conflicts. External changes can also trigger conflict if regulations or changing market conditions change the relative importance of different organizational groups. People differ in their values and worldviews. These differences are a source of values conflict, or conflict arising from perceived or actual incompatibilities in beliefs about what is good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair. Values conflicts can arise when people or groups have different values or a different understanding of the world. Remember, uncertainty is one of the primary drivers of conflict. Poor communication increases uncertainty and can thus increase the potential for conflict. Informational conflict occurs when people lack important information, are misinformed, misinterpret information, or disagree about what information is relevant. When one person or unit is dependent on another for resources or information, the potential for conflict increases. Structural conflict is the result of structural processes or features of the organization. Structural conflict can be horizontal or vertical. Understanding conflict is critical to managing conflict in organizations. Conflict escalation happens when one party involved in a conflict, an individual, a group, department, or the entire organization, first uses an aggressive tactic or begins using a more aggressive tactic than the other party. When constructive approaches to conflict resolution are unsuccessful and break down, the conflict escalates. The farther the conflict escalates, the more difficult it is to reverse and more likely it is to become dysfunctional. Generating feelings of empathy and sympathy and keeping both parties focused on common goods also helps de-escalate conflict. Fairness and the appearance of fairness often decrease the risk of workplace violence when conflicts do occur. Even if it does not escalate quickly, unresolved conflict drains employees' energy and reduces their performance. It's obviously easier to manage a conflict escalation in the early stages of the conflict. If you're involved in a conflict, one of the best ways to prevent further escalation is to react equivalently to the other party and not overreact. As a manager, you can reduce conflict escalation by modeling de-escalation processes and by setting and enforcing limits on conflict escalation. After a conflict is resolved, it's important to re-establish a sense of justice and trust among the parties. Strengthening shared goals and shared identities can help to reduce the potential for future conflict. When we are in conflict, we also feel emotionally charged. In fact, we're often unaware that we're in conflict until we recognize that we're emotional about something. There is an important distinction between perceiving conflict and feeling conflict. Conflict is often not recognized until it's felt. Many people let their feelings and emotions influence how they deal with conflict. Controlling your emotions and staying focused on the issues can help prevent a conflict from escalating. Assessing and acknowledging the emotions of the other party can also help you to be more effective in managing your conflict. Conflict escalation happens when a party involved in a conflict, an individual, a small group, department, or entire organizations, first uses an aggressive tactic or begins using more aggressive tactics than the other party. There are 5 conflict management strategies that differ in their concern for others and concern for individuals' interests. This figure illustrates how these 5 styles of managing interpersonal conflict compare in their focus on others and pursuing one's self-interests. Collaborating reflects a high concern for your own interests and a high concern for the interests of the other party. This conflict management style emphasizes problem solving and pursues an outcome that gives both parties what they want. Collaborating helps to build commitment to the outcome, although the communication required to reach such a solution can take substantial time and energy. Compromising is a conflict management style in which each side sacrifices something in order to end the conflict. This middle ground style reflects a moderate concern for your own interests and a moderate concern for the interests of the other party. A compromising style is often used to achieve temporary solutions, to avoid destructive power struggles, or when a conflict must be resolved quickly. Competing is a conflict management style resulting from a high concern for your own interests and a low concern for the other party. This approach is generally used when the conflict issue is important or to set a precedent. However, because one party is trying to dominate the other, this conflict management style can escalate the conflict and the loser may try to retaliate. Accommodating is a cooperative conflict management style. Accommodating reflects a low concern for your own interests and a high concern for the interests of the other party. This conflict management style is generally used when an issue is more important to the other party than it is to you. Avoiding is a passive conflict management style involving ignoring the conflict or denying it exists. The style reflects a low concern for your own interests and a low concern for the interests of the other party. When this strategy is used to manage trivial conflicts, no damage may be done, but it can result in maximum damage when important issues are involved. In general, each style of handling interpersonal conflict is appropriate and ethical in some situations as long as it is used to attain the organization's proper goals. Remember, because people differ in their preferred conflict management style, it's important to adapt your own style accordingly. Conflict is a disagreement that arises when two or more parties perceive a threat to their interests, needs, or concerns. Putting it all together, the conflict process is summarized in this figure. Where a conflict is triggered, disagreement occurs, an emotion is either felt or not felt. In the case where emotion is felt, conflict escalates, and then we manage conflict. Where emotion is not felt, conflict does not escalate. After a potential conflict is triggered, it's perceived by both parties. The true disagreement may differ from the perceived disagreement. Conflict is often accompanied by misunderstandings that exaggerate the perceived disagreement. If neither party experiences emotion in reaction to the potential conflict, it does not escalate. A person's ability to successfully resolve conflict is related to his or her effectiveness as a leader. Conflict is a disagreement that arises when two or more parties perceive a threat to their interests, needs, or concerns. Most people dislike conflict. It's seen as easier, less stressful, and less risky to one's career to avoid conflict and suppress dissenting opinions, despite their effectiveness in stimulating more creative and effective ideas and solutions. Often, we're unsure of whether or not we're correct, and we also may fear ridicule or rejection. Yet organizations that avoid conflict will have an increasingly difficult time competing successfully in the global environment. So what can managers do to increase the positive outcomes of conflict? The creative, innovative, and very successful design firm IDEO has 3 rules for brainstorming. Concentrate on the quantity of ideas, don't criticize other ideas, and elaborate and build on other ideas. Rewarding employees who engage in constructive conflict can help reduce employees' fears of ridicule and rejection. A simple thank you for voicing a dissenting opinion can signal to employees that it's okay to speak up. Hiring employees who are comfortable with constructive conflict and who tend to use effective conflict management strategies can also enhance constructive conflict and improve organizational performance. Assigning 1 or more employees to play the role of devil's advocate can help generate a constructive conflict. Negotiation is a process in which 2 or more parties make offers, counteroffers, and concessions in order to reach an agreement. Most managers do a lot of negotiating as part of their jobs. Job offers and contracts with customers and suppliers have to be negotiated. Resources have to be secured and shared with other departments, and agreements have to be made with bosses and subordinates. There are 2 types of negotiation: distributive and integrative. Let's take a look at each. Distributive negotiation occurs under zero-sum conditions, where any gain to one party is offset by an equivalent loss to the other. Distributive negotiation essentially distributes resources among the parties involved. Because distributive negotiation structures the conflict in a win-lose way, it tends to be competitive and adversarial. Integrative negotiation is a win-win negotiation in which the agreement involves no loss to either party. In general, integrative bargaining is better than distributive bargaining because when it's over, neither party feels like they've lost. Integrative bargaining helps build good, long-term relationships and minimizes grudges between parties. This is particularly beneficial when the parties have to work together on an ongoing basis once the negotiations are finished. 4 fundamental principles of integrative negotiation are: separate the people from the problem, separate relationship issues or people problems, such as emotions, misconceptions, and communication issues, from substantive issues and deal with them independently. Focus on interests, not positions. Negotiate about things that people really want and need, and not what they say they want or need. Invent options for mutual gain. Look for new solutions to the problem that will allow both sides to win, rather than just fighting over the original positions that assume that one side will win and the other side might lose. Insist on objective fairness criteria. Outside objective fairness criteria for the negotiated agreement are ideal if they exist. Here are some suggestions for being an effective negotiator. Don't look at a deal as an either-or proposition. Negotiating is about compromise. Make sure each side knows each other's perceptions of the issues and each other's interests. Identify what you can and cannot part with. Try to identify and use sources of leverage. Leverage consists of anything that can help or hinder a party in a bargaining situation. Show the other side that you understand their position. Help the other person see that you're an ally by mirroring their emotions. Suppress your emotions. Negotiations can become tense and stir emotions. Constantly reminding yourself of your goal can help you to maintain an appropriate level of detachment and continue to see the deal clearly. Stay rationally focused on the issue being negotiated and take a break if emotions start to flare up. Know your BANTA. The acronym BANTA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. It is what you could have done had no negotiation take place, or what you will do if you cannot reach an agreement with the other party. Cultural differences can play a major role in negotiation. This process is sometimes called alternative dispute resolution. There are 3 types of ADR, or alternative dispute resolution. Let's take a look at each. In conciliation, a third party builds a positive relationship between the parties, improves their communication, and facilitates their discussion. Conciliation facilitates a discussion and directs the parties towards a satisfactory settlement and may issue a binding option if both parties agreed to that ahead of time. Conciliation is often the first step in ADR processes. Its goal is to get the parties to better communicate and resolve the problem on their own. Although the conciliator may suggest a resolution that the parties can accept or reject, arbitration and mediation also pursue the ideal of a fair outcome. In mediation, an impartial third party, the mediator, facilitates a discussion using persuasion and logic, suggesting alternatives and establishing each side's priorities. The mediator suggests a settlement that does not have to be accepted. Mediation is a voluntary and non-binding process, whereas the results of arbitration are legally binding. If the conflict has not escalated too much and both sides are motivated to resolve their conflict through bargaining, mediation can be very effective. If the mediator is perceived as neutral, he or she may likely not be effective in the situation. In arbitration, a third party is involved and usually has the authority to impose a settlement on the parties. Arbitration may be required by contract or by law, or may be voluntary if the parties agree to it. The negotiating parties can establish rules for the arbitrator, such as restricting the arbitrator to one of the negotiator's final offers, or freeing the arbitrator to make judgment he or she wishes. Although arbitration, unlike mediation, always results in a settlement, it has greater potential to leave at least one party dissatisfied, which could cause conflict to resurface later. An ombudsman is someone who investigates complaints and mediates fair settlements between aggrieved parties. Ombudsmen help to resolve disputes while they're relatively small.